Prima sesiune pe care am pregătit-o astăzi este aceea de prezentarea raportului pe care Safeguarding Hub pentru Europa de Est l-a realizat privind riscurile de safeguarding ale persoanelor LGBTQI+, refugiate din Ucraina. Prezentatoarea de astăzi este Veronica Ahlenback. Ea este specialist în violența bazată pe gen și lucrează pentru partenerul nostru din program Social Development Direct. Ea se va conecta online. Veronica, ne auzi? Dacă îți poți deschide microfonul. Ok. Ne aude? Ok. O putem auzi și noi în sală? Veronica, poți vorbi, te rog? Veronica, can you please speak?
Yeah, sure. I wasn't sure if you could hear me. Yes, I will. Thank you so much, Elena, and thanks everyone who just spoke. It's really great to join you today, albeit remotely. I'm really excited about this roundtable, so thanks to all the organizers. Sorry, I can actually put my camera on as well. I hope you can see me in the room.
Yes.
Perfect. I'm ready to start the presentation. Will you have the slides in the room and drive it from there?
Veronica, can you wait for us 1 second, please?
Yes, sure.
We are just trying to figure a way to see you and also the presentation on the screen at the same time.
All right. Otherwise, I can put my camera off and I can do the presentation and then come back on camera and we do the questions. What do you think?
It's going to be a bit challenging, so we are just going to leave the presentation, okay? Thank you.
Okay, let's do that. I'll put off the camera. All right. So as Elena said, I'm Veronica. I work for Social Development Direct. I focus on gender-based violence and safeguarding, and I've been leading on the LGBTQI inclusion work in RSH Eastern Europe. So I will present the findings today from a piece of research that we have conducted in the 3 countries where we are working. And that resulted in a regional report. So I will present the findings from the regional report because we did find out that the findings were very similar across Romania, Moldova, and Poland. But I will try where possible to also highlight some specific findings from Romania, but just so that you're aware that this is giving you the bigger picture of what the situation is looking like across these countries, because we did see that LGBTQI communities and refugees do face similar risks across the countries. And I will run through my presentation and then we can take questions at the end. Next slide, please. So before we launch into the research, I just wanted to give a brief overview of how we understand safeguarding and PSEA from the Safeguarding and Resource Hub Eastern Europe side. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, but just to run through it before we go into the research presentation. So in its essence, safeguarding refers to keeping recipients of humanitarian and development assistance and the people who deliver this safe from all forms of harm. So this means taking all the necessary steps as organization and as individuals to prevent harm from taking place in the first place and respond in a timely and appropriate way when harm has occurred. And later in this roundtable, we will also have a session focused on safeguarding those working in organizations. But with this research that I will present now, we focused on the external safeguarding and the external risks facing LGBTQI refugees when they encounter organizations. Safeguarding also, of course, include preventing sexual exploitation and abuse, PSEA, but it also includes preventing from other forms of harm. And here, as the resource Safeguarding and Support Hub, we take a broad definition of harm So it ranges from discrimination, verbal abuse and harassment, to physical harms and violence that can occur in the delivery of aid. And previous speakers already mentioned some specific forms of harm that LGBTQI refugees are at risk of, and we'll look closer at those during the presentation. And as someone else mentioned, denial of services is also a form of harm that we have been looking at, as that prevents people from accessing their rights and meeting their basic needs. So this means that all work that we do as a sector, as service providers, as organizations, as individuals that are part of the support to refugees, this work must be underpinned by a do no harm approach. So the do no harm principle is in itself broader than safeguarding work, but it can be applied to our safeguarding thinking, which is something that we have done throughout this research and as RSH Eastern Europe. So doing no harm means ensuring that no actions that we undertake intentionally or unintentionally have any negative impacts on the affected population. So we have seen that do no harm that can sometimes be used as an argument, or maybe one can say as an excuse for organizations to not consider LGBTQI people in their work, saying that they are afraid or worried that what they do might cause harm or that they will be doing the wrong thing. So this is a valid concern, but it should also not be taken as an excuse for doing nothing when it comes to ensuring equal and safe access to services for LGBTQI people, which is often what we have seen. So rather doing nothing to make services safe and inclusive, that can cause harm in itself. And that is, of course, the very thing that we are trying and aiming to avoid through safeguarding policy and practice. So instead, we need to carefully consider how to ensure that services and support is LGBT inclusive and in a way that ensures no harm is caused along the way. So this leads me to the next slide on why we have conducted this research. I just wanted to frame this a little bit more broadly in the Hub's broader work. So from the onset, the Safeguarding and Support Hub Eastern Europe has been committed to taking an intersectional approach to understanding safeguarding. So this means understanding how safeguarding risks do not affect everyone equally, but recognizing that some individuals and groups are at increased risk of being targeted for sexual abuse, exploitation, harassment, as well as other forms of harm because of who they are. So this might be related to people's identities, to their social and health status, to their cultural language, to their lived experience, or other aspects and characteristics that makes people at increased risk of being targeted. So we conducted an initial assessment at the very early stages of the program to better understand the safeguarding needs in the region. And this assessment found that Roma people, LGBTQI people, and persons with disabilities are particularly at risk of safeguarding violations in the humanitarian response. So based on this, LGBTQI inclusion became one among these other focus areas as part of the Hub's inclusive safeguarding work. So we have also focused on disability inclusion and inclusion of Roma people in safeguarding work. And you can find resources related to this on our website, where we have a page dedicated to our inclusive safeguarding resources. So at the early stages of doing this initial scoping and work, we also realized that there is very limited information available when it comes to LGBTQI inclusive safeguarding. So this is both in terms of the situation for LGBTQI refugees fleeing Ukraine, and also in terms of what organizations are actually doing to support LGBTQI refugees. So we found kind of a double evidence gap in this regard. Next slide, please. So in order to bridge some of this evidence and knowledge gap, we decided to conduct further research on this topic and not only do desk-based research, but actually also conducting primary research and collecting data to understand the situation better. So this research that I will present now, it had a twofold purpose. First of all, to identify safeguarding risks facing LGBTQI refugees in Poland, Romania, and Moldova. And secondly, to understand the current safeguarding awareness and practices among LGBTQI organizations working in the refugee response, and to identify good practice and lessons learned. So we decided to focus on the work of LGBTQI organization in this piece of research. And this had several reasons why we decided on that focus. our initial scoping and the desk-based research, it indicated to us that the LGBTQI organizations are actually often the first responders to LGBTQI refugees that flee Ukraine. And they quickly mobilized to support the community following the outbreak of the war. And many, for the first time, took on the kind of more humanitarian and rapid response work. So we thought it would be very valuable for the wider sector to actually learn from this practice and their ways of working with LGBTQI refugees. And we also know that LGBTQI organizations and communities, they have this long experience of navigating risks and thinking around safety and risk assessment. So we thought there would be actually a lot to learn from that work. And we particularly wanted to identify good practices and generate some lessons learned, since this was such a gap in the evidence base. So we thought speaking with LGBTQI organizations would be a very good place to start. But that said, we also recognized that this is the limitations, that we didn't speak with other humanitarian organizations to understand what they are currently doing. But we hope that is an area that we can also learn more about in the future. So yeah, just a brief look at the methodology before going into the findings. So this is a purely qualitative research. We interviewed representatives of 10 LGBTQI organizations in Romania, Poland, and Moldova. The interviews were conducted by a team of national researchers with experience working on LGBTQI rights in each country. And as I said, the findings from each country contributed to a regional report where we present the findings from all 3 countries. And it also includes a set of recommendations based on these interviews. And all organizations that we interviewed, they worked actively to support LGBTQI refugees from Ukraine. So this was the main inclusion criteria for which organization we interviewed. And in addition, we ensured that organizations we interviewed also represented the diversity of the LGBTQI community, so including trans-led organizations and organizations for LGBTQI women. So I think I've touched a little bit on the limitations already, but just some additional ones to keep in mind as we go through the findings. First of all, there was a lack of reported data and official reports on safeguarding incidents against LGBTQI community members in each country. So this is not a surprise, as we know that stigma, fear, lack of reporting mechanisms, etc., prevent people from reporting safeguarding incidents. So this should not, of course, not be taken as an indication that safeguarding incidents do not affect LGBTQI refugees, but rather tells us that this is still a hidden issue in many ways. Now, as I mentioned, there's very limited literature on the topic, and this includes in Romania, in the region, and globally. And this is also a reason why we decided we wanted to do some primary research, albeit quite small, as there wasn't enough information that we could find online. So therefore, we interviewed LGBTQI organizations in particular to learn from their experience. But it should be noted that the safeguarding risks that were identified by the research, they are based on observations of these risks, of reflections by the LGBTQI organizations who work closely with the community. So in some cases, that would include observation of actual incidents that have occurred, but also concerns that organizations have based on what they know about the context, what they know about the specific risks that LGBTQI people are facing in the context. So I think that was everything on methodology and limitations. So now let's move into the findings. So I'll start with the safeguarding risks, and then we will kind of look at the good practices that we identified. So these, as I mentioned, these safeguarding risks facing LGBTQI refugees are not unique for Romania, but we found these across the 3 countries. So this is kind of the compiled findings from the region. But I've also highlighted some that were particularly flagged in Romania to the right across the slides. So first of all, there is the risk of discrimination and so-called outing, meaning that someone discloses that you are part of the LGBTQI community without your consent. So this could be perpetrated by actors in the humanitarian response when LGBTQI people are trying to seek assistance. And this was this was recognized as a risk that could have severe consequences for the person being outed, in turn leading to another set of risks, of course. And this is a risk that many LGBTQI organizations perceived prevented many LGBTQI refugees from seeking services from humanitarian service providers in the first place, because of this fear of being disclosed, of being discriminated against. And many might instead turn to LGBT organizations, as these are perceived as providing safer spaces and safer services. Then there is the risk of being risk associated with LGBTQI refugees being hosted in non-vetted hostels and families who have negative attitudes and who do not accept LGBTQI persons. And this also came up in the 3 countries, including in Romania. It was recognized that if hotel or hostel owners or host families haven't received any orientation or any training or awareness raising on LGBTQI issues and rights, there is a high risk of discriminations and incidents occurring if LGBTQI people are being hosted without mechanisms to ensure that that is a safe environment. Thirdly, we have the lack of appropriate and safe accommodation options. And this was highlighted as a problem, especially for trans persons. And this was especially recognized as a risk in government-run accommodation facilities across the countries, leading to, again, a range of risks stemming from that cause, risks of harassment and violence in shared accommodation. And in Romania, trans refugees were also identified to be at particular risk of mistreatment by healthcare service provider who may have discriminatory attitudes and who are not equipped to provide safe and inclusive services for trans people. And the last slide on this, the last point on this slide relates to the risk identified in LGBTQI spaces as well, which is also very important to recognize. And this was also brought up by the research, that of course safeguarding incidents can also occur in LGBTQI specific services and spaces, which are often perceived as more safe spaces for LGBTQI people. But it is important to recognize that safeguarding incidents can occur also in these places, and there's the same need for having, of course, safeguarding policies and practices in place. So this includes the risk of discrimination, harassment, and violence in shelters. And this was particularly flagged if people are kind of having to share limited space that lacks privacy, that might increase the risk of conflicts rising. And this also came up in Romania, as well as in other countries, as LGBTQI organizations recognize that they often have limited resources and they can't provide sufficient space for everyone who are in need of shelter. And that can lead to more people having to share small spaces and so on, increasing that risk. Next slide, please. Another thing that came up in the research was that LGBTQI refugees risk being targeted for sexual exploitation when private persons or civil persons who offer support or accommodations reach out, but they are not vetted. And organizations, primarily in Poland, but I think this came up in other countries as well, they reported that they've seen cases where people from the host community or even abroad have contacted LGBTQI refugees directly, or organizations working with LGBTIQ refugees to reach out and offer help. But sometimes they suspected that this was actually a risk of situations that could lead to sexual exploitation and harassment. So this goes beyond the risk posed by non-vetted hostels and host families, as this was more people actively reaching out to offer help to refugees. And this also presents a risk if people are not being vetted. Providing referrals to external health services, this was also recognized as a potential risk, as the service providers may in turn hold discriminatory attitudes and cause harm to LGBTQI refugees. So we'll look later at how organizations mitigated this risk. Data protection and the risk of data breaches was another area of potential risk that LGBTQI organizations identified. no one shared any examples of where this had happened, but everyone were very aware about this being a risk and kind of having mitigations and strategies in place to mitigate that risk. As organizations often, they collect personal and store personal data, which could, of course, if it ends up in the wrong hands, be used to target and harm LGBTQI people. Next slide, please. So what are the impacts of these safeguarding risks? There are, of course, many and diverse possible impacts, but these are some of those that were flagged up by the research and which immediately comes to mind. So many of the risks identified, they actually stem from the lack of safe and inclusive practices in terms of how to make services available and accessible to LGBTQI refugees in the first place, where organizations providing services pay little to no attention to the specific risks faced by LGBTQI refugees. So an immediate impact of the lack of these safe and inclusive services is, of course, exclusion from accessing services, which in turn lead to the denial of meeting basic needs, such as having safe shelter, food, other basic goods. So in Romania, LGBTQI organizations, they observed that many LGBTQI refugees, they may choose to try to hide their identity when trying to access humanitarian services in order to reduce this or try to reduce this risk of discriminations, outings, and other safeguarding incidents. And of course, in addition to the immediate discrimination and exclusion, there is also the risk of sexual exploitation and abuse, verbal and physical violence, and other forms of harm. And in Romania, it was also recognized that the risk of being targeted because of being LGBTQI, it also overlaps with risks associated to discrimination based on ethnicity and race, which can, of course, amplify that risk of being targeted as well. So ultimately, what we can see from this is, of course, that the lack of safe and inclusive services, it means that service providers and humanitarian actors actually fail to fulfill their mandates and uphold the do no harm principle that we talked about in the beginning. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let's move into the second focus area of this research. I hope I'm not running through it too quickly, but we have this second area as well that is looking at what LGBTQI organizations are currently doing to mitigate the number of safeguarding risks and prevent these from materializing. So the first strategy that most of the organizations used was actually what was their core activities in the humanitarian response, and that is providing LGBTQI inclusive services as an option to the general shelters for refugees that were recognized as carrying risks facing LGBTQI refugees. And one way that LGBTQI organizations sought to enhance safety in their own shelters and other services was to establish clear policies and contracts setting out rules and expectations for those staying in the shelters. And some organizations, they decided to only assign existing staff with experience of already working with LGBTQI communities to working with the LGBTQI refugees. So instead of assigning, for example, new volunteers that don't have prior experience of working directly with LGBTQI communities or refugees, but finding other tasks for them that doesn't involve the direct contact with refugees. So some of them only had like a small group of trusted and experienced people who would have that kind of direct contact with LGBTQI refugees. Some LGBTQI organizations, they had developed reporting and feedback mechanisms where LGBTQI refugees using their services could raise any issues and report safeguarding incidents if these occurred. But this was quite varied, the extent to which organizations had this in place. And in Romania, we could actually see that some LGBTQI organizations working in the refugee response, they also had a strong focus on how this can affect staff well-being, and they had well-being and mental health support in place to support their staff working with refugees, which was really positive to see, as we know that burnout and high levels of stress is a real issue in civil society organizations. working in the refugee response, and perhaps particularly those who are constituency led as well. Next slide, please. So other good practices that LGBTQI organizations had in place was that some provided further training to staff on how to work in safe and inclusive ways with different LGBTQI populations. So for example, some organizations recognized that they still needed more internal training to strengthen their internal knowledge and capacity to work in trans-inclusive ways. So they provided training to all staff on this. Other things that came up were, of course, having codes of conduct, ethical codes, HR policies, doing reference checks, etc. That was also commonly shared by organizations as a way to mitigate and prevent safeguarding incidents. And one good practice that we saw in Romania was that one of the LGBTQI organizations actually reached out at the beginning of the response, reached out to LGBTQI organizations in other countries. I think it was in Greece, to learn from their experience of setting up and running shelters in order to take that learning and strengthen their own internal systems and practices. Next slide, please. So in response to the risk of discrimination by service providers, many organizations described that a strategy that they used was to only provide referrals to trusted service providers who have undergone some kind of training on sexual orientation and gender identity to mitigate the risk of harm. So they wouldn't provide referrals to any services, but only those that they kind of had built a network of trusted service providers that they could use. And in response to the risk associated with collecting personal data from LGBTQI refugees, several organizations described various steps that they have taken to minimize the risk of data breaches and harm occurring from that. So one thing they did was to minimize from the beginning the data that you collect, to have the minimum amount of data to conduct the work, and never sharing data with other actors. Some of the organizations had very clear processes outlined for that, who have access to data, and storing the data in safe places. So one organization, for example, they only had data on devices that will never leave the office, and make sure that they have dedicated safe places for keeping the devices safe. And in response to the risks of non-vetted individuals posing safeguarding risks, several organizations described that they collaborated with LGBTQI organizations in other countries so that they could support safer onward journeys for LGBTQI people who wish to move to another country. So this could, for example, be through connecting LGBTQI refugees with trusted LGBT organizations in other countries, to reduce the risk that LGBTQI refugees are being exploited when traveling on to their next destination. So really going through trusted networks as opposed to people reaching out to individuals. Next slide, please. Yes, we have reached the end of this presentation, which is on the recommendations. And these were informed by the interviews with LGBTQI organizations in the 3 countries. So first of all, an important principle is to consider partnering with local LGBTQI organizations. They are best placed to lead on strategies to advance LGBTQI inclusive safeguarding, and they have that in-depth understanding of the local contexts and the risks facing LGBTQI refugees in these contexts. However, and this cannot be stressed enough, this should be done in meaningful and non-extractive ways. So needless to say, this includes that LGBT organizations should be involved from the beginning, so that they are consulted at the early stages and are being compensated for their time and expertise, of course, and be engaged in meaningful ways and understanding what that looks like for organizations. There is also a lot that organizations can do, which does not necessarily require partnering, but it is important to consider internal capacity and understand what expertise you need for furthering LGBTQI inclusive safeguarding, which might be through providing training, reviewing internal policies, etc., and consider who is best placed to support on that. And we believe that LGBTQI organizations, as well as individual professionals specializing in LGBTQI rights, they hold much of that needed expertise. Secondly, tailor the safeguarding support to the needs and capacity of LGBTQI organizations. So this includes, for example, recognizing the high workloads that many LGBTQI organizations who are active in the refugee response are under, and adapt the formats and timing and resources and support to the situation that they are in. So this recommendation is perhaps aimed for those who might actually seek to collaborate with LGBT organizations on strengthening safeguarding systems. And as we could see from the research, LGBTQI organizations are at very different stages of their own safeguarding journey. Many welcomed further support and funding to develop their own safeguarding practice as well. But when seeking to do so, it's important to have that close dialogue with everyone involved and finding ways of working that is tailored to the organizations and the situation. The third recommendation is around supporting learning exchange on LGBT inclusive safeguarding. So this is kind of a good practice that we did see that some organizations had used. So this can include supporting networking opportunities and spaces for collective support and exchanging experiences and practices with other LGBTQI organizations on safeguarding. And this was also something that came up in interviews, and some LGBT organizations, they welcome such learning exchanges and learning from organizations who are further along on their safeguarding journey. So yeah, as I mentioned, we did see a good example of this in Romania, where an organization had reached out and collaborated with LGBTQI organizations in Greece to in the early stages of the response to strengthen their processes and practices. And lastly, and this is a key recommendation, the humanitarian sector as a whole need to advance LGBTQI inclusive safeguarding. And it's very crucial to recognize that, of course, safeguarding LGBTQI populations in humanitarian emergencies, as well as LGBTQI staff working in these emergencies, it's everyone's responsibility. And all organizations must ultimately step up action to prevent harm from occurring to LGBTQI refugees. So this should no longer be optional, but it's actually a critical aspect of organizations' ability to fulfill their mandates and the humanitarian principles that they are guided by, including non-discrimination and do no harm. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that was actually all from me on the presentation of this report. I just wanted to thank everyone who's been involved in this research, not least Lenny Emson, who co-authored the regional report with me, and all our national researchers who worked on conducting the interviews and analyzing that, and of course, all the LGBTQI organizations who were involved in the research. And in case you haven't seen the report, you can find it here either on the link, or you can scan the QR code, which will take you to the report. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Veronica, for such a comprehensive presentation on safeguarding needs, but especially practices that we hope you can, bring to your very own organizations, because these are very useful and important in order to safeguard the LGBTQI+ refugees in your activities. I would like to open the floor to questions. I'm also realizing that I'm speaking in English, but okay. If there are any immediate questions from the public.
Hello. Hi, Veronica. This is Pablo Zapata, UNHCR. Probably was not the object of the study, but did you come across to specific cases where some of these risks were materialized? And if you can give a little bit or comment a little bit on that, because one of, let me not elaborate further, but I would like to know if some cases, specific cases came up or whether we are speaking about general valid risks, or both. Thank you.
Thanks, Paolo. Elena, should we take one question at a time or collect a few?
Yes, please. Yes,
okay, then I'll start with that. Yeah, thanks for that question. I would say it was a mixture of both. As I mentioned in the limitations of the research, one barrier to really understanding the extent of safeguarding incidents affecting LGBTQI refugees is really that there is a lack of data and reported cases because of the different barriers, stigma, fear, etc. But we did speak with LGBTQI organizations about this because we believe that they, of course, have observed and heard about risks in their contexts. So it was a bit of a mix of both. There were some cases that organizations shared that had definitely happened when LGBTQI refugees had tried to access services in general by general service providers and in government-run shelters and similar. Some other risks, they were perhaps not risks that organizations had observed, but they were very aware of based on what they know about the situation in the countries. So yeah, it was a bit of both, a mix, I would say. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Yes, Elisa.
Hello, Veronica. My name is Eliza. I work for Save the Children Romania. I'm curious about, the biggest or the one that had an impact on you, a good practice from Poland or Moldova regarding offering services to refugees in vulnerable positions, and maybe a good practice that we can import here or, share with our colleagues. I think it would be very nice to hear one example. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa, for that question. Oh, it's difficult to, I think, pick out one, but what immediately comes to mind for me was one of the main areas of support that LGBTQI organizations provided was to provide safe spaces, shelters, accommodation, because that was something that was recognized as an immediate need, as it was perceived that government-run or other actors, shelters and accommodation in particular, did not take into account the needs of LGBTQI populations. So that was something that most of the organizations that we spoke with provided, but it was recognized that in most cases they didn't have enough funding or resources to provide that to everyone in need, or the spaces could become quite crowded, and so on, which I described in the presentation. So that providing safe and inclusive accommodation, I would say, is a key practice, and something that needs to be considered in general accommodation centers and shelters. Secondly, something that kind of underpinned the other practices was to work. For example, LGBTQI organizations, they can often not provide all the services that LGBTQI refugees are in need of, so they need to collaborate with others and provide referrals and so on. And they mainly did that through working with these trusted organizations that they have done previous trainings with. So I would say that the training and awareness raising and supporting the capacity of different service providers and actors is really critical as well, to ensure that the range of services that LGBTQI refugees need are available in some form in a safe and inclusive way. So sometimes that was building on the work that organizations have done prior to this situation, having conducted trainings and so on, And in some cases, I believe they conducted further training now during the response to support that capacity of other actors to be able to accommodate and work with LGBTQI refugees. Back to you, Elena.
Constantina?
Thank you. Veronica.
It's working.
Yeah. Veronica, Constantina from the PSA network. Unsurprisingly, a PSA-focused question about reporting and complaint mechanisms and feedback mechanisms. I wanted to ask either if you had any discussions about experience of LGBTIQ+ refugees, finding them not inclusive enough, or any recommendations about how the network and the members of the network could make our feedback and complaint mechanisms more inclusive, other than the obvious, like training the staff. If there's any other recommendation that came up in one of the 3 countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Constantina. I'm afraid we didn't really touch on that in the research. When it came to reporting mechanisms and feedback mechanisms, we talked about that in the context of LGBTQI organizations and what they themselves had in place. So yeah, I'm afraid I don't have actually much to share on that, whether other mechanisms that exist were perceived to be inclusive or not. Sorry.
Thank you, Veronica. Are there any other questions? Yes. Mihaela?
Hello, Veronica and everyone. I'm Mihaela from Sensi Blue. We do offer social services to protect women from gender-based violence in Romania. And yes, unfortunately, I can confirm what you said, what the study shows. And among our hundreds of women, we had, for example, just one person with disability reported and none from the LGBTQI community. Of course, it's a matter of how you start collecting data and the criteria you use, because if you have this from the start and you have the criteria, you will know the data. So unfortunately, yes, it's the same situation in our organization. And maybe we can improve this through partnerships, as you said, as you suggested. What I wanted to ask is if maybe through the interviews you could find out if there are any differences, like any regional differences between the 3 countries, Poland, Romania, Moldova, maybe also Ukraine, from what you know from previous research, in terms of conservative ideology, because I believe this is basically the foundation. You know, if you have a society where the traditional family is strongly supported, then probably people will fear to talk about their identity. And so if you come with this background in another country, probably doses of fear will still be there. So this is actually a question about conservative thought in those countries. And otherwise, like, I don't want to take too much space, but I had this reflection, this idea, because you talked about the principle of do not harm. And I thought about, wow, this is actually, it's great. And how do you do this? How you do not harm when you're not aware enough, when you're not informed enough, when you don't have the experience? Because from my point of view, what really changes the mindset is the experience of working together with people from the community as colleagues in the organization, in partner organizations, or really working with refugees which are from the community, because that's when the moment when you find out that they are under more pressure. Basically, it's the needs of the normal refugee plus the fear, plus probably the plan to change something, like, you know, go through a process of changing body parts. I'm not, you see, exactly, it's this type of, I don't want to do something, I don't want to say something wrong, I don't want to harm, but I don't know how to navigate this myself. It's probably, sometimes it's a sensitive topic when I want everyone to feel fine, but I don't have the skills myself. And it's just through exposure, it's just through experience that we learn this. So, sorry, I will go back to the question about the conservative thought.
Thanks so much, Mealia, for that question and for those reflections. There were quite a lot to, I think, unpick in what you shared. So I'll try to comment on the different parts and also respond to your main question. But I think, yeah, thanks for sharing your experience that you could see in the service that you provided, that there were a few that you're aware of, persons with disabilities and LGBTQI women accessing the services. And I think that is, of course, not unusual to see, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that we don't know all the time who the different identities of people who are accessing services and that we are working with, because people might not be comfortable disclosing their identities, and people shouldn't have to either to access services. I think yeah, that also kind of illustrates the need for organizations to, regardless of having data on who is accessing services, to actually think about how to make services more inclusive and safe for people in their diversity, because we know that people for many reasons will not disclose their identities when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity and sexual characteristics. So that's just something, yeah, important to keep in mind. That's, I don't think we necessarily need that data to be able to take that step and start thinking about more inclusive practices. Although data can, of course, be helpful, but it's also a lot of safety and ethical considerations to think through around what data to collect, how to store it, etc. And yes, thanks for sharing the reflections as well on the do no harm principle and what does that mean in practice, because it is a very valid concern that you don't want to do harm and want to do this in a safe and meaningful way. And I think there's no one way to do it, but I would just say that for each organization, even within RSH Eastern Europe as well, it's really been a learning journey, and where we have to take small steps and break it down into small steps and see where do we need to start to eventually get to a place where people in the organization feel more confident and supported to work on LGBTQI issues. So that could be starting to look internally what internal training or capacity building we might need, whether it's related to terminology, the situation in the context, practical measures around your services. And as you said, connecting with the stories and the experiences of LGBTQI community members can be really powerful. So I think that goes back to one of the recommendations that we have in the report, which is to collaborate and to consult and reach out to LGBTQI organizations who also have this expertise and involve them in meaningful ways. That could be a good place to start. And lastly, coming to your question around whether we saw any regional differences, I think to answer that question, I would really like to have the researchers in the room who are the ones who are familiar with the country context and could reflect on that in depth. But what I would say is that I think we saw similar, but of course differences across the regions as well, or across the countries. But also, it might also be, we see differences between urban and rural areas as well when it comes to values and attitudes towards LGBTQI communities. I would say perhaps more than being a different country-based differences, it's also looking at the differences within countries, between urban and rural centers, and how attitudes can differ. Several organizations mentioned that, of course, the situation can be more challenging in rural areas for LGBTQI people, and the services that are provided, they tend to be centered in urban areas as well. So yeah, sorry I can't share any more in-depth reflections on that, but I'm not sure if we might have some of the researchers in the room as well and online, so I would also invite them to share on that if there are any here. Thanks. Back to you, Elena.
We have Ruth here, but I think perhaps she could elaborate a bit more during the panel discussion, maybe, because yes, we've overpassed our time for this session, although I do want to ask one question, please. Please allow me. I have one question. I make the rules. So, Veronica, you've mentioned the fact that there is, mass underreporting of SEA incidents, which is, something that we see country-wise as well, so not only reflecting the LGBTQI plus group. Is there, one or two good practices that you could share with us that organizations could use to, work with LGBTQI plus individuals to build that faith to report situations of sexual exploitation, abuse, harassment, discrimination? Yeah, that would be, I think, very, very helpful.
Thanks, Elena. It's a really, really good question, and I think one that we would all like to understand and have the answer to. And I'm not sure I necessarily have, but I can share some thoughts. And I'm just thinking, when you're mentioning trust, I think, again, understanding from the LGBTQI organizations who have that close connection to the communities what the barriers are. And perhaps if LGBTQI or people, refugees, might be more, it might be easier for them to report to LGBTQI organizations if they have mechanisms, something around linking up with those organizations as well, and understanding if they get any reports. I'm not sure if those linkages are there in the current systems, but I'm thinking, yeah, they will be able to support on that and yeah, understand how that trust can be supported, I think. Yeah, and thank you so much for all the questions. I understand we're out of time, but I will be on the line throughout the session. So yeah, we can also perhaps, if there's any time at the end, pick up some questions as well. But I want to give enough time to other speakers. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Veronica.